They sent her west to humiliate a man they'd never met. Maylin Whitaker wasn't chosen because she was worthy. She was chosen because she wasn't. In a Boston parlor thick with cigar smoke and cruel laughter, her stepmother sealed her fate with a smile sharper than any blade. "Send the Chinese girl," Margaret said. "No one will miss her." But what began as mockery would become something else entirely. This is the story of a woman who refused to disappear, who turned shame into strength and built something they could never destroy. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The grandfather clock in the Whitaker parlor struck 7, each chime landing like a gavel in the silence that followed Margaret's pronouncement. Maylin stood near the doorway, not quite in the room, never quite out of it. That had been her position in this house for 8 years now, ever since her father had died and left her at the mercy of his second wife. She'd learned to make herself small, to occupy the spaces between furniture and conversation, to exist without demanding acknowledgement. But tonight, acknowledgement had found her anyway. "The Chinese girl?" Thomas Whitaker Jr. repeated, lowering his brandy glass. He was Margaret's son from her first marriage, a man of 32 who'd inherited his mother's sharp tongue and none of his late stepfather's kindness. "Mother, surely you're joking." Margaret Whitaker sat in the wingback chair that had once been Maylin's mother's favorite, her posture perfect, her smile poisonous. "I assure you, Thomas, I am entirely serious. Mr. Hayes requested a refined bride from a respectable Boston family. We shall provide exactly that." "But her?" Thomas gestured toward Maylin with his glass, sloshing amber liquid. "Father may have married her mother, but that doesn't make her—" "Doesn't make her what?" Margaret's voice cut clean. "A Whitaker? Oh, but she is, legally speaking. Your father saw to that before his untimely death, making sure his little Chinese widow and her half-breed daughter would bear his name forever." The word untimely dripped with something that wasn't quite grief. How thoughtful of him to saddle us with such a legacy. Maylin's hands, clasped in front of her simple gray dress, tightened until her knuckles went white. She'd heard variations of this speech before, but repetition didn't dull the edges. "The rancher specifically requested education and refinement," Margaret continued, warming to her subject now. The evening light through the tall windows caught the diamonds at her throat, bought with Maylin's father's money. "Maylin has had the best education money can buy. We made certain of that, didn't we? Miss Porter's school, music lessons, French, all of it. We've spent a fortune making her presentable." "Presentable?" Thomas snorted. "Is that what we're calling it?" Margaret's smile widened. "She speaks beautifully, reads extensively, plays piano adequately. On paper, she is everything Mr. Hayes requested. In person." She let the sentence hang, unfinished and damning. Maylin had stopped breathing. She knew what was coming, could feel it building like a summer storm. "In person," Margaret said, "she is exactly what she appears to be. A disappointment, a burden, a girl no decent Boston family would want for their son, no matter how pretty her manners or how excellent her penmanship." She turned her gaze directly to Maylin for the first time that evening. "Isn't that right, dear?" The question demanded an answer. Silence would be insubordination. Agreement would be surrender. Maylin lifted her chin, just slightly, just enough. "I am what you've made me, Mrs. Whitaker." It was the wrong thing to say, or perhaps the right thing, depending on what she'd intended. Margaret's eyes flashed. "What I've made you? Child, I took you into this home when I could have sent you to an orphanage. I clothed you, educated you, tolerated your presence at my table despite the whispers it caused among our circle. And this is the gratitude I receive? I didn't mean, you never mean anything, do you? You simply exist here, taking up space and resources, contributing nothing, refusing even the marriage proposals we've managed to secure despite your circumstances." Margaret stood, her silk skirts rustling. 3 proposals in 5 years, Maylin. 3 decent men willing to overlook your heritage for the Whitaker name and dowry, and you rejected them all, because they'd looked at her the way Thomas was looking at her now, like something curiosity and revulsion in equal measure, because their proposals had come with conditions about children, about how any sons would need to look enough like their fathers, about how she'd need to stop speaking Chinese entirely, even in her own head. "I didn't find them suitable," Maylin said quietly. "Suitable?" Thomas barked a laugh. "She didn't find them suitable? Mother, this is rich. The girl who should be grateful for any attention at all has standards. Margaret raised a hand, silencing her son. Her eyes never left Mei Lin's face. Mr. Hayes' letter arrived 3 weeks ago. A rancher from Wyoming Territory, a wealthy one by all accounts, seeking a bride of education and grace to help him establish his position in society. He offered a generous sum to facilitate the arrangement. How generous? Thomas asked, suddenly interested. Generous enough, Margaret said, and he was quite specific. He doesn't want some frontier girl who can barely read. He wants a woman who can host dinners, manage a household, represent his interests with visiting dignitaries and business partners. He wants, in short, exactly what Mei Lin has been trained to be. Except for the part where she's... Thomas began. Yes, Margaret interrupted smoothly, except for that, which is precisely why this arrangement is so perfect. She began to pace, her movements calculated, theatrical. Consider it, Thomas. Mr. Hayes will receive precisely what he requested, a Whitaker bride with impeccable credentials. We will receive his money, and more importantly, a permanent solution to our little difficulty. She gestured vaguely toward Mei Lin. And when he sees what he's actually gotten, well, that will be his problem, not ours. The room went very quiet. Mei Lin felt something cold slide down her spine. You're sending me there knowing he'll reject me. Reject you? Margaret's eyebrows rose in mock innocence. Why ever would he do that? You're exactly what he asked for. Educated, refined, respectable. Her smile turned cruel. What happens after the wedding is hardly our concern. Perhaps he'll grow to appreciate your unique qualities. Or perhaps he'll realize his mistake and ship you even further west, to California or Oregon. Either way, you won't be our responsibility anymore. Thomas was grinning now, understanding blooming across his face like rot. It's brilliant, Mother. Absolutely brilliant. We fulfill the contract, collect the money, and rid ourselves of the embarrassment all in one stroke. We're not monsters, Margaret said, though her tone suggested otherwise. We'll provide an appropriate trousseau, letters of introduction, everything proper and correct. Mei Lin will arrive in Wyoming Territory as a Whitaker bride should, well-dressed, well-equipped, and well-documented. And well-doomed, Thomas added, raising his glass in a mock toast. Mei Lin looked between them, at Margaret's satisfied expression, at Thomas's cruel amusement, at the life she'd endured in this house for 8 years, crystallizing into a single, brutal clarity. They weren't just removing an inconvenience, they were performing an execution, only instead of a noose, they were using distance and deception. I could refuse, she said. The words came out steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Margaret's smile didn't waver. You could. And then what, dear? Where would you go? You have no money of your own. Your father's estate came to me as his widow. You have no family in Boston, no prospects, no skills beyond what we've given you. You could seek employment, I suppose, though I can't imagine who would hire you for anything respectable. A Chinese girl with a white name and expensive education, too refined for menial work, too obvious for anything else. There are places, Mei Lin started, thinking of the Chinese community in the city, the networks her mother had once known. Places that would take you in? Margaret's voice dropped, losing its theatrical quality, becoming something harder and more honest. Perhaps you could scrub floors in a laundry, serve tea in some dim sum house, marry some immigrant laborer who can barely speak English. Is that what you want? To throw away everything you've been given, everything your father wanted for you, to go back to what your mother was before she caught his eye? The mention of her mother struck like a physical blow. Mei Lin's mother had been a merchant's daughter, educated and accomplished in ways that didn't translate to American expectations. She died when Mei Lin was 10, leaving behind a daughter who belonged nowhere, too Chinese for Boston society, too American for Chinatown. Your father married my mother because he loved her, Mei Lin said, her voice barely above a whisper. Your father, Margaret said, married your mother because he was lonely and foolish and swayed by a pretty face. He married me because he needed someone who could navigate society, who could manage his affairs, who could give him the respectability his first marriage cost him. And look what he left me with. A business on the verge of collapse, debts he never mentioned, and a stepdaughter who serves as a constant reminder of his poor judgment. Thomas poured himself another drink. Just take the offer, Mei Lin. Go west, Marry the rancher. Start fresh. It's more than you'd get here. It's a trap, Maylin said. It's an opportunity, Margaret corrected. You're 26 years old, past the age when most women marry, past the point of youthful appeal. This may be your last chance at any kind of marriage at all. Mr. Hayes is wealthy, established, looking for a wife. Perhaps he'll be more open-minded than Boston society. Perhaps he'll value your qualities rather than focus on your deficits. Or perhaps not. But either way, you'll be his responsibility instead of ours. The clock chimed the half hour. Outside, a carriage passed on the cobblestone street, its wheels creating a rhythm that sounded like running, like escape. Maylin thought about her options. They were right. She had nowhere to go, no money, no real prospects. The Chinese community might take her in, but Margaret was right about that too. She'd lived too long in this world of pianos and French lessons and dinner parties to fit easily into any other. She'd been shaped by this house, these people, these expectations. They'd made her into something that belonged nowhere. When would I leave? She asked. Margaret's smile was triumphant. 2 weeks. That gives us time to prepare your trousseau and make the necessary arrangements. Mr. Hayes is sending funds for your travel, first-class accommodations all the way to Wyoming Territory. He's sparing no expense for his bride. His bride who doesn't know she's a joke, Maylin said flatly. His bride who is exactly what he asked for, Margaret corrected. What he does with that information once he has it is not our concern. Now, we have much to do. Thomas, send word to Madame Rousseau about the dresses. Maylin will need a wedding trousseau appropriate for her new station. Nothing too expensive, but everything proper. We wouldn't want Mr. Hayes to think we've cheated him. The irony of that statement hung in the air, heavy and bitter. Thomas drained his glass and stood. I'll send word in the morning. For tonight, I think this calls for a celebration. We're about to become significantly less encumbered. Thomas, Margaret said, though her tone held amusement rather than reproach. Show some decorum. Maylin is still family. Until she leaves, at least. Of course, Mother. My apologies. Thomas sketched a mocking bow toward Maylin. Congratulations on your upcoming nuptials, dear sister. May your husband have better luck with you than we've had. He left the room laughing. Margaret moved to the writing desk, already composing the necessary letters in her mind. You may go, Maylin. I'm sure you have much to think about. Try not to look so grim. You're about to become a rancher's wife. Some might consider that an adventure. Maylin didn't move immediately. She stood there, looking at the woman who had controlled her life for 8 years, who had just sentenced her to exile and humiliation with the efficiency of a business transaction. Did you ever consider, Maylin asked, what it might have been like if you'd simply treated me as your daughter? If you'd given me a chance to belong here? Margaret paused, her hand hovering over the paper. For a moment, something almost like regret crossed her face. Then it hardened into the familiar mask of disdain. You were never my daughter, Maylin. You were your father's mistake, one I've been paying for since the day he died. If I've been unkind, it's because kindness would have been crueler. It would have given you false hope that you could ever truly be one of us. Better you know the truth. Better you understand what you are and what you are not. What I am, Maylin said softly, is someone you underestimated. Margaret laughed. Brave words from a girl with no choices. Go pack your things, dear. Wyoming awaits. Maylin turned and walked out of the parlor, her footsteps measured and careful on the polished floors. She climbed the stairs to her room, the smallest bedroom on the 3rd floor, the one with the window that didn't quite close properly and let in winter drafts. Inside, she closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing herself to breathe. The room was sparse. They'd never let her make it truly hers. Her mother's few possessions were in a trunk under the bed. Silk handkerchiefs embroidered with peonies, a jade bracelet, letters written in Chinese characters that Maylin could barely read anymore. Her father had encouraged her to embrace American culture, to leave the old ways behind. By the time she'd realized what she was losing, it was already mostly gone. She moved to the window and looked out over the Boston streets, gas lamps beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there was a whole world she'd never seen. Wyoming Territory. She knew almost nothing about it except what she'd read in books. Wild, untamed, dangerous. They were sending her there to fail. They expected her to be rejected, abandoned, destroyed. Maylin pressed her hand against the cold glass and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope. She wasn't naive enough for that. But something harder, sharper, something that felt almost like anger, but clearer, pure. They'd been trying to break her for 8 years, and she'd bent. She'd accepted their insults, their dismissal, their casual cruelty. She'd made herself small and quiet and tried to earn affection that was never going to come. But they'd made one mistake. They'd taught her too well. They'd given her education, manners, skills, language, everything she needed to navigate their world. They'd made her into exactly what they claimed she could never be: refined, accomplished, capable. And now they were sending her somewhere new, somewhere none of them had ever been, to a man who didn't know her history, didn't know she was supposed to be a disappointment. Maylin turned from the window and looked at her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser. Dark eyes looked back at her, set in a face that had caused her nothing but trouble in Boston. Her mother's face, her father used to say. Beautiful, he'd called her, though no one else ever had. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to prepare for a journey that was supposed to end in her humiliation. Maylin began to smile, slow and deliberate. They'd given her an opportunity, though not the one they'd intended. They were sending her away to embarrass a stranger, but what they'd actually done was set her free. She had 2 weeks to plan, 2 weeks to prepare, 2 weeks to decide exactly who she was going to be when she stepped off that train in Wyoming territory. Not their victim, not their joke. Someone else entirely. Someone they would never expect. Someone who refused to break. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange blur of activity. Madame Rousseau arrived with fabric samples and measuring tapes, creating a trousseau that was expensive enough to be impressive but not so lavish as to suggest genuine affection. Dresses in muted colors, grays, browns, deep greens. Nothing too bright, nothing too joyful. For a rancher's wife, Madame Rousseau explained in her heavy French accent, we want practical elegance, yes? Nothing too delicate for the frontier. Margaret supervised every decision, ensuring that Maylin's wedding dress was white but simple. Her traveling suits were serviceable but refined. Every choice calibrated to maintain the illusion while minimizing the investment. Maylin stood for the fittings without complaint, let them pin and tuck and measure. She listened to their conversations about her as if she weren't there. Will she need evening gowns? Madame Rousseau asked. Margaret considered. 1 or 2. Mr. Hayes mentioned entertaining business associates and territorial officials. We wouldn't want him to think we sent him a bride who couldn't manage a dinner party. Even though we know she'll never actually host one, Thomas added from his position by the window. He'd taken to attending the fittings, finding entertainment in Maylin's systematic preparation for disaster. Thomas, Margaret said mildly, don't be crude. At night, alone in her room, Maylin made different preparations. She went through her mother's trunk, selecting what to bring. The jade bracelet, that was essential. The embroidered handkerchiefs, a small book of Chinese poetry that she couldn't fully read but couldn't bear to leave behind. She also went through her father's old study when the house was quiet. Margaret had claimed most of it, but there were things she'd overlooked. Papers about his business, maps, letters. Maylin took several maps, including one of Wyoming territory. She studied it by candlelight, memorizing names of towns, rivers, mountain ranges. Hayes Ranch was marked in someone's hand, probably from correspondence. It sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, far from any major settlement. Isolated, remote, good. The fewer people who knew her story, the better. She also found money, not much, but some. Bills and coins her father had apparently hidden in various books, perhaps forgotten after his death. Enough for emergencies. Enough to suggest he'd valued having options. Maylin pocketed every cent. She wrote letters too. Not many. She had few friends, and none she could tell the truth. But she wrote to Miss Chen, who ran a small shop in Chinatown and had known her mother. She didn't explain everything, but she hinted. If things went wrong in Wyoming, if she needed help, Miss Chen would remember. Always have a way out. Her mother had taught her that, one of the few lessons that had survived translation from one world to another. The day before her departure, Margaret held a small gathering. Not a party, nothing so celebratory. Just tea with a few select Boston matrons, a chance to demonstrate that, yes, the Whitaker family was making an appropriate match for their difficult stepdaughter. Maylin sat in the parlor, wearing one of her new dresses, pouring tea and answering questions with perfect politeness. Wyoming territory, Mrs. Harrison said, her tone suggesting Maylin had announced she was moving to the moon. How pioneering of you. Mr. Hayes has built something quite impressive, from what we understand, Margaret said smoothly. Thousands of acres, successful cattle operations, connections to the territorial government. Quite a step up from our modest Boston life. The lie was so smooth, so practiced. Margaret had been refining it for 2 weeks, turning Maylin's exile into an advantageous match, her humiliation into an opportunity. "And you're not frightened?" Mrs. Pemberton asked Maylin directly. "Of the wildness out there? The savage elements?" Maylin met her eyes. "I've survived Boston society, Mrs. Pemberton. I imagine I can survive Wyoming." Several women laughed, unsure if she was joking. Margaret's smile tightened fractionally. "Maylin has such spirit. It will serve her well on the frontier." After the guests left, Margaret cornered Maylin in the hallway. "You will be respectful," she said quietly. "You will not embarrass us, even from a distance. You will write proper letters, maintain proper appearances, and if things don't work out with Mr. Hayes, you will handle it discreetly. Is that understood?" "Perfectly," Maylin said. "Good. Your train leaves at 9 tomorrow morning. Thomas will accompany you to the station, see you properly settled. After that..." Margaret's expression was unreadable. "After that, you're on your own." "I've always been on my own, Mrs. Whitaker." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "Yes," she finally said. "I suppose you have. Perhaps that will serve you better than I intended." That night, Maylin packed her trunk with careful precision, every item chosen, considered essential. The trousseau Margaret had provided, her mother's treasures, the maps and hidden money, books. She'd be allowed some books, surely. She chose carefully. Practical guides, novels, nothing too sentimental. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in layers of cloth, she placed the small porcelain figure her mother had brought from China, a woman in flowing robes, her face serene, her posture suggesting motion even in stillness. "She's leaving," her mother had told her once. "See how she's turned? She's walking away from something. But look at her face. She's not running. She chose to go." Maylin wrapped the figure carefully and closed the trunk. The morning came gray and cold. Thomas loaded her trunk into the carriage with the help of their driver, his expression already bored with the day's task. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching but not approaching. No goodbye, no embrace, no last-minute softening. Just a nod. Maylin climbed into the carriage, arranging her traveling dress around her. The newest one, dark blue with black trim. Appropriate for a long journey. Practical. Forgettable. The carriage lurched forward. Thomas lit a cigar, filling the small space with smoke. "Mother thinks you might actually make it out there. I told her you'd be back within a year, tail between your legs, begging to scrub our floors." Maylin looked out the window as Boston rolled past. "Then I suppose one of you will be disappointed." "We'll see." The train station was chaos. Noise. Steam. People rushing in every direction. Thomas handed her over to a porter with the efficiency of someone completing an unpleasant chore, paid the man to see her settled in the first-class compartment, and left without another word. Maylin found her seat. A private compartment, actually. Hayes had paid for the best. Whatever else he was, he apparently valued appearances. She settled in as the train began to move, watching Boston disappear behind her. The city where she'd never belonged, where she'd spent 8 years being reminded of her inadequacy, where every door had been closed except the one marked exit. They'd wanted to humiliate her. They'd wanted her to fail. But as the train picked up speed, carrying her away from everything she'd known toward everything uncertain, Maylin felt something they'd never intended her to feel. Relief. Hope. And beneath both of those, harder and clearer than anything she'd felt in years, determination. Let them laugh. Let them assume she'd break. Let them think they'd won. She'd show them what a woman with nothing left to lose could become. The train rolled west, and Maylin Whitaker rolled with it, leaving behind the girl who'd stood silent in that Boston parlor, and carrying forward something they'd never see coming. Herself. The train's rhythm became Maylin's entire world for 6 days. Click, clack, click, clack. Each rotation of the wheels carrying her further from everything she'd known and closer to everything uncertain. She watched America unfold through her compartment window, like pages in a book she'd never been allowed to read. Endless farmland giving way to rolling hills. then mountains that scraped the sky with peaks still white with snow even in late spring. Other passengers came and went at various stops. A banker from Philadelphia who tried to engage her in conversation until she pretended to fall asleep. A young mother with 3 children who looked at Mei Lin with open curiosity but said nothing. An older woman who shared her compartment for half a day and spent the entire time knitting something shapeless while humming hymns slightly off-key. Mei Lin spoke to none of them more than necessary. She was practiced at being invisible, at occupying space without demanding attention. It was a skill Margaret had inadvertently taught her, and now it served a different purpose. The less anyone remembered about her, the better. At night, when the train stopped at various stations to take on water and coal, Mei Lin would step out onto the platforms and breathe air that tasted different with each passing mile. Less salt, more dust, less industrial smoke, more wood smoke and distance. The stars grew brighter as they traveled west, more numerous, as if someone had punched holes in the darkness to let the light bleed through. She read during the day when she wasn't staring out the window. Not the novels she'd brought. Those required too much concentration, too much emotional investment. Instead, she studied the practical guides. What to expect in frontier territories, how to manage a household with limited resources. Basic medical care when doctors were days away. The books painted a picture far different from Boston. No calling cards, no formal dinners, no intricate dance of social expectations that had defined her entire life. Just survival, work, and the land itself demanding everything you had. She tried to imagine Daniel Hayes. The letters Margaret had received from his representative had been formal, businesslike. A rancher of means seeking a wife of education and refinement. No physical description, no details about his personality, nothing that suggested what kind of man would seek a bride through correspondence rather than finding one locally. Either he was desperate or he was particular, or both. Mei Lin studied her reflection in the window glass as darkness fell on the 4th night. Her face looked back at her, ghostly and uncertain in the lamplight. What would he see when he looked at her? The same thing everyone in Boston had seen. Someone who didn't fit, who occupied the wrong spaces, whose very existence was a reminder that the world didn't always follow the rules polite society preferred? Or would he see something else? She couldn't decide which possibility frightened her more. On the morning of the 6th day, the conductor came through announcing they'd reach Bitter Creek by afternoon. It wasn't her final destination. That was still another full day by stagecoach. But it marked the transition from rail travel to something more primitive. Mei Lin gathered her belongings with careful precision, making sure everything was secure in her trunk. The jade bracelet she wore now, hidden under her sleeve. The money was distributed in 3 separate places, some in her reticule, some sewn into the lining of her traveling case, some in a small pouch tied around her waist under her corset. Never keep all your options in one place. The train pulled into Bitter Creek just after 2 in the afternoon, and Mei Lin's first thought was that whoever had named this town had a gift for accuracy. It looked bitter, dusty, hard-edged, temporary somehow, as if the buildings might blow away in a strong wind and no one would particularly mourn their loss. She stepped down from the train onto a wooden platform that creaked under her weight. The air hit her immediately, dry, hot, carrying the smell of horses and dust and something she couldn't quite identify. Not unpleasant, exactly. Just foreign. Miss Whitaker? Mei Lin turned to find a young man in dusty clothes and a hat that had seen better days. He couldn't have been more than 20, with a sunburned face and eyes that widened slightly when he got a good look at her. There it was. That expression. The one she knew so well. Yes, she said, keeping her voice level. I'm Mei Lin Whitaker. He recovered quickly. She'd give him that. I'm Tom Ridley, ma'am. Mr. Hayes sent me to collect you and see you safe to the ranch. We've got a long ride ahead, so if you'll show me your trunk, we can get loaded up and moving before it gets too late. Mei Lin pointed out her trunk among the pile being unloaded. Tom hefted it with a grunt, then looked at her again as if trying to reconcile something in his head that wasn't adding up. Mr. Hayes, he started, then stopped. Mr. Hayes is expecting you tomorrow. We won't make it to the ranch before nightfall, so we'll stop at a way station about 6 hours north. You'll have a room there, proper and respectable. Then tomorrow we'll cover the last stretch. I understand, Mei Lin said. Thank you for the clarification. He blinked at her formal speech, then nodded and headed toward a wagon loaded with supplies. Mei Lin followed, acutely aware of the stares she was attracting. A Chinese woman in expensive traveling clothes wasn't something Bitter Creek saw often, apparently. The wagon was serviceable but hardly comfortable. Tom helped her up onto the seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away from the station, Mei Lin caught snatches of conversation from the men loitering outside the nearby saloon. That Hayes's bride? Must be. Trained from Boston, just like he said. Well, ain't that something? Wonder if he knows what he's getting. Tom's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He just snapped the reins and urged the horses into a faster trot, leaving the town behind in a cloud of dust. They rode in silence for the first hour. The landscape was unlike anything Mei Lin had ever seen. Vast, empty, beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Mountains in the distance, closer than mountains had any right to be, their peaks touching clouds. The sky stretched overhead like a blue dome, deeper and wider than any sky in Boston. "It's different than I expected," she said finally, surprising herself by speaking first. Tom glanced at her. "What's different?" "All of it. The space, the colors, even the air feels different." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I suppose it would, coming from a city. You been to Boston all your life?" "Most of it." She didn't elaborate. "Must be quite a change, then. Wyoming territory ain't like anywhere else. Takes some getting used to, but most folks who stay learn to love it. The ones who can't handle it usually know pretty quick." There was a question in there somewhere, one he was too polite to ask directly. Mei Lin let it hang unanswered. Another mile passed before Tom spoke again. "Mr. Hayes is a good man, fair, honest, works harder than any 3 men I know, and I know some hard workers. He doesn't suffer fools, but he doesn't make them suffer either, if you know what I mean." "I'm not sure I do." "He expects people to pull their weight, do their jobs right, but he's patient with mistakes if you're trying. It's the ones who don't try that get shown the road." Tom shifted the reins from one hand to the other. "The ranch is successful because he makes it successful. Didn't inherit it, didn't marry into it, built it from nothing over 10 years. Mei Lin absorbed this. "Why did he send for a bride? Surely there are women in Wyoming who might have suited him." Tom's expression closed off slightly. "That ain't really my story to tell, ma'am. Mr. Hayes will explain what he wants to explain when he's ready." "Fair enough." The sun tracked across the sky as they traveled, and the temperature dropped as they climbed in elevation. Mei Lin was grateful for the shawl in her traveling case. She pulled it out and wrapped it around her shoulders, trying not to think about how exposed they were out here. No buildings, no other travelers visible in any direction. Just empty land and the two of them in a wagon that suddenly felt very small. "Are there bandits?" she asked. Tom looked surprised by the question. "Sometimes. Not usually on this route. Not enough traffic to make it worthwhile, but we've got a rifle under the seat if needed, and I'm a decent shot." He paused. "Can you shoot?" "No." "Might want to learn. Out here it's a useful skill. Not just for bandits, snakes, wolves, injured animals. A woman alone on a ranch should know how to handle a gun." "A woman alone on a ranch?" The phrase settled over her like a cold blanket. That's what she might be, wasn't it? If Hayes took one look at her and decided Margaret's cruel joke wasn't worth entertaining. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat the food Tom had packed. Dried meat, hard biscuits, and water that tasted vaguely of metal from the canteen. Mei Lin ate mechanically, not tasting anything, her mind already racing ahead to tomorrow's arrival. As they resumed their journey, Tom seemed to relax slightly. He pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation that meant they were halfway to the way station, a creek bed that would be flowing after spring melt but was dry now, a distant line of trees that marked the property line of a neighboring ranch. "How many ranches are out here?" Mei Lin asked. "More than you'd think, fewer than you'd hope if you needed help quick." Hayes Ranch is one of the bigger operations. We've got about 40 men working steady, more during roundup and branding season. Mr. Hayes has been buying up land parcels as they become available, consolidating. He's got a good eye for it, knows which pieces are worth the investment. And he runs all of this himself? He's got help. Jack Crawford is the foreman, been with Mr. Hayes since the beginning. There's a few other key men who keep things running when Mr. Hayes has to travel for business. But yeah, ultimately, it's all on him. That's part of why he wanted a wife, I expect. Someone to manage the household end while he manages the ranch. Mei Lin felt something twist in her stomach. He wanted a partner, then. Someone capable. Someone who could handle responsibility without constant supervision. Someone unlike the helpless, disappointing burden Margaret had painted her to be. The way station appeared just as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that hurt to look at directly. It was a rough structure, logs and mud, a peaked roof, smoke coming from a chimney that leaned slightly to one side. But it was solid, and light shone through the windows in a way that suggested warmth and food and rest. A woman emerged as they pulled up, older, weathered, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. "Tom Ridley," she said, her voice rough as the landscape. "Right on time, as usual, and this must be the bride." "Mrs. Fletcher, ma'am, this is Miss Maylin Whitaker from Boston." "Miss Whitaker? Mrs. Fletcher runs the best way station between here and Cheyenne." Mrs. Fletcher looked Maylin up and down with the thoroughness of someone evaluating livestock. Whatever she concluded, her expression didn't reveal it. "Well, come on then. You'll be wanting to wash up and eat something that doesn't taste like trail dust. Tom, get her trunk inside. You can have the small room in back. Miss Whitaker gets the good room upstairs." Inside, the way station was cleaner than Maylin had expected and warmer than she'd hoped. A fire burned in a large stone hearth, and something was cooking that smelled like heaven after 6 days of train food and 1 afternoon of dried meat. Mrs. Fletcher led her upstairs to a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the darkening landscape. It wasn't fancy, but it was private and clean. "Supper's in 20 minutes, Mrs. Fletcher said. "There's water in the pitcher, fresh this morning. Privy's out back if you need it. And Miss Whitaker?" She paused in the doorway. "Whatever you're expecting tomorrow, try not to decide everything before you've even got there. Wyoming has a way of surprising folks." She left before Maylin could respond. Alone, Maylin sank onto the bed and let herself feel the exhaustion of the past week. Her body ached from days of sitting, her mind felt scraped raw from constant vigilance, and her emotions were a tangled mess she didn't have the energy to sort through. Tomorrow she would meet Daniel Hayes. Tomorrow she would discover if this was freedom or just a different kind of prison. Tomorrow everything would change, one way or another. But tonight, she was just tired. She washed her face and hands in the cold water from the pitcher, changed into a fresh shirtwaist, and went downstairs to face whatever Mrs. Fletcher's cooking and Tom's polite conversation could offer. Supper was stew, thick, hearty, filled with vegetables and meat, and flavor that made Maylin's eyes water with unexpected emotion. When had she last eaten something made with care rather than obligation? Mrs. Fletcher served generous portions and asked no questions, for which Maylin was grateful. Tom ate quickly, thanked Mrs. Fletcher, and excused himself to see to the horses. That left Maylin alone with the older woman, who poured coffee into 2 tin cups and settled into a chair by the fire. "Sit," Mrs. Fletcher said, gesturing to the other chair. "You look like you could use the heat." Maylin sat, wrapping her hands around the coffee cup. The warmth felt good against her palms. "Tom's a good boy," Mrs. Fletcher said, staring into the fire. "Loyal, works hard. He thinks the world of Daniel Hayes, same as most of the men on that ranch. That tells you something." "What does it tell me?" "That Hayes treats his people right. Men don't stay loyal to someone who treats them poorly, not out here where there's always another ranch looking for hands. Hayes pays fair, doesn't work his men to death, and he stands behind them when there's trouble." She sipped her coffee. "Of course, he's also particular, expects things done right the first time. Doesn't tolerate laziness or dishonesty." "You know him well?" "Well enough. He stops here regular when he's traveling, always pays his bill, never makes trouble. We've talked some over the years. He's a complicated man, but not a dishonest one." Maylin chose her words carefully. "Tom mentioned Mr. Hayes built the ranch himself. That must have been difficult. Near impossible, more like. He came here with nothing but determination and some money he'd saved working other people's ranches. Bought a small parcel of land nobody else wanted and made it work through sheer stubbornness. Now he's got one of the most successful operations in the territory. That kind of success makes a man powerful, and power makes him a target." "A target for what?" Mrs. Fletcher's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Jealousy, competition, people who think he's gotten too big too fast, who want to take him down a notch, or take what he's built. That's why he needs a wife who can hold her own. Someone who can manage the household, represent him in society, and not fall apart when things get hard." She paused. You seem like you might be tougher than you look. I've had to be. Good. You'll need that toughness tomorrow and every day after. Mrs. Fletcher stood, collecting the empty cups. Get some sleep, Miss Whitaker. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and you'll want to meet it rested. Maylin climbed the stairs to her room, feeling like she'd just been given both a warning and a blessing. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to unfamiliar sounds, wind against the walls, some nightbird calling in the distance, the creak of old wood settling. She thought about Daniel Hayes, this man she'd never met, who had somehow become the axis around which her entire future turned. Was he good or cruel? Patient or demanding? Would he see her as Margaret had, as a disappointment and a burden? Or might he see something else? And which did she want him to see? Sleep came eventually, restless and full of dreams that evaporated the moment she woke to find gray morning light seeping through the window. The final day of travel began with a breakfast of eggs and biscuits that Maylin forced herself to eat despite having no appetite. Tom was already loading the wagon when she came outside, his movements efficient and practiced. Should reach the ranch by mid-afternoon, he said, helping her up onto the seat. Mr. Hayes knows we're coming today. He'll be waiting. The words settled in Maylin's stomach like stones. They traveled north through landscape that grew increasingly dramatic. The mountains were closer now, close enough that Maylin could see individual trees on their slopes, could make out the white of snowfields that never fully melted. The valleys were greener here, fed by runoff from those peaks, and she began to see cattle, hundreds of them, scattered across vast pastures marked by wooden fences that seemed to stretch for miles. Hayes cattle, Tom said, following her gaze. Best stock in the territory. Mr. Hayes is particular about breeding, brings in bulls from back east to improve the herd. It costs more up front, but the payoff is worth it. They passed a group of men on horseback, moving cattle from one pasture to another. The men waved at Tom, but their eyes lingered on Maylin with open curiosity. Word travels fast out here, Tom said apologetically. Everyone knows Mr. Hayes sent for a bride. They're curious. I imagine they are. They'll judge you fair, though. Ranch folks care more about what you do than who you are. You pull your weight, treat people decent, they'll accept you. It's not like cities where everything's about family names and social standing. Maylin almost laughed. If only he knew how little her family name had protected her, how much her social standing had been worth in Boston. Less than nothing. A liability. But here, maybe it could be different. Maybe. The ranch buildings appeared gradually, revealed by the rolling landscape like a secret being slowly told. First, the main house. Larger than she'd expected, 2 stories of whitewashed wood with a wide porch and windows that caught the midday sun. Then the barn, massive and red, surrounded by corrals and smaller outbuildings. Bunkhouses for the men. A stable, what looked like a blacksmith's forge. A smokehouse. It was a compound, really, a self-contained world. Tom guided the wagon up a long drive lined with young trees that hadn't yet grown tall enough to provide shade. As they approached the main house, Maylin saw a man standing on the porch, and her heart began to hammer against her ribs. Daniel Hayes. It had to be. He was tall. She could see that even from a distance. Broad-shouldered, standing with the kind of stillness that suggested either patience or tension. She couldn't tell which. As they drew closer, details emerged. Dark hair, clean-shaven face, clothes that were work-worn but clean. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, maybe less, and he was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Tom pulled the wagon to a stop. The silence that followed felt enormous. Daniel Hayes descended the porch steps slowly, his eyes never leaving Maylin's face. She saw the moment comprehension hit him, the slight widening of his eyes, the fractional pause in his movement. He knew. Of course he knew. She wasn't what he'd expected. Mr. Hayes, Tom said, climbing down from the wagon. This is Miss Maylin Whitaker from Boston, just like you requested. Daniel Hayes moved closer, and Maylin forced herself to meet his eyes. They were blue, she saw now, very blue against his tanned face. And the expression in them was complex, surprise, yes, but also something else. Calculation, maybe, or confusion. Miss Whitaker, he said, and his voice was deeper than she'd expected, roughened by years of shouting orders across open range. Welcome to Wyoming territory. He didn't offer to help her down from the wagon, didn't extend his hand in greeting, just stood there, looking at her as if trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly gotten much more complicated. Maylin climbed down herself, grateful for her practical traveling clothes that didn't require assistance. She stood before him, chin lifted, shoulders straight, every inch the refined Boston lady Margaret had trained her to be. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Thank you for the invitation. The journey was long but uneventful." "I'm sure it was." He was still staring, not even trying to hide it now. "Tom, get Miss Whitaker's trunk inside. Use the blue guest room." "The guest room?" Tom sounded surprised. "But sir, I thought, "The guest room," Daniel repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Not the mistress's room, then. Not the room of a bride about to be married. The guest room." Tom grabbed the trunk and headed inside, leaving them alone in the dusty yard. Maylin could feel eyes watching from the barn, from the bunkhouse, from every window and doorway. The whole ranch was watching this moment, waiting to see what would happen. Daniel Hayes took a step closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the scar above his left eyebrow, the way his jaw was clenched tight. "Did they think this was funny?" he asked quietly. The question hit her like a slap, not angry exactly, just flat, resigned. "Yes," Maylin said, because lying seemed pointless. "They thought it was hilarious." He nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he'd already suspected. "The letter I received described a refined young lady from a respectable Boston family, educated, accomplished, suitable for managing a household, and representing my interests in society. Everything was accurate except for one rather significant detail." "Everything was accurate, including that detail," Maylin said, surprising herself with the sharpness in her voice. "I am refined. I am educated. I am from a respectable family, however much they might wish otherwise. The letter didn't lie, Mr. Hayes. It simply didn't include my mother's heritage, which my stepmother assumed would matter more to you than any of my actual qualifications." His eyebrows rose. "Your stepmother. She controls the Whitaker household now. My father died 8 years ago. His second wife has been trying to dispose of me ever since. And I was the disposal method. You were the perfect solution. Send me far enough away that I become someone else's problem. If you rejected me, she could claim shock and disappointment while being secretly delighted. If you kept me—" Maylin's voice wavered slightly. "Well, then I'd be your problem instead of hers." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "You knew what they were doing." "Yes. And you came anyway. I had nowhere else to go." The honesty of it hung between them, raw and uncomfortable. Maylin waited for him to tell her to get back in the wagon, to send her away, to confirm that she was exactly as unwanted here as she'd been in Boston. Instead, he said, "Come inside, we need to talk." The house was cooler inside, shaded from the midday sun by thick walls and curtained windows. Maylin followed Daniel Hayes through a wide hallway with wooden floors that gleamed despite the dust that must constantly blow in from outside. The furniture was sparse but solid, pieces built for function rather than show, though she noticed care had been taken. No dust, no disorder. Someone maintained this house with attention. He led her to a room that was clearly his office. A large desk dominated the space, covered in papers, ledgers, and maps weighted down with rocks. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books that looked actually read rather than decoratively displayed. The other wall held a window overlooking the corrals, where men were working with horses that looked half wild. Daniel gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Sit." It wasn't quite an order, wasn't quite an invitation. Maylin sat, keeping her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Every inch the proper lady, even as her world balanced on the edge of collapse. He didn't sit. Instead, he moved to the window, staring out at his ranch while the silence stretched between them like something physical. Maylin counted her breaths, trying to stay calm, trying not to think about what would happen if he told her to leave. Where would she go? How would she survive? "I'm trying to decide, Meg," Daniel said finally, his back still to her, "whether to be angry at them or at you." "Be angry at them," Maylin said. "I didn't lie. They did." He turned to face her. "But you came anyway, knowing what they'd done. That makes you complicit. It makes me desperate. There's a difference." "Is there?" He moved to lean against his desk, arms crossed. "You could have written to me, warned me, given me a choice before you traveled all this way. Would you have believed me? A letter from the unwanted stepdaughter claiming her family was playing tricks? Or would you have assumed I was trying to sabotage the arrangement out of spite or jealousy? He considered that, his jaw working. Maybe. Probably. And even if you believed me, you would have simply found another bride, someone more suitable. While I remained in Boston with a stepmother who now had proof that I was willing to betray family secrets to strangers, my position there was barely tolerable as it was. It would have become impossible. So you chose to make it my problem instead. The words stung because they were true. Maylin met his eyes without flinching. Yes, I chose survival over honesty. I'm not proud of it, but I won't apologize for it either. You wanted a capable wife who could manage a household. I am that, regardless of what I look like. Everything in that letter about my education and accomplishments was true. I graduated from Miss Porter's school. I speak French. I can manage accounts, plan menus, organize staff, host dinners. I've been trained for exactly the role you described. As espèce by a woman who hated you. Which means I learned to do it perfectly, because anything less than perfect gave her ammunition. Daniel was quiet again, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. She didn't. She held his gaze and waited. I paid a significant amount of money for this arrangement, he said. The travel expenses, the dowry to your family, the preparations here at the ranch. I've told my business associates and neighbors to expect my new bride, someone who could help me solidify my position in territorial society. Do you understand what that means? What's at stake? You want to be taken seriously. You want respect, influence, a seat at important tables. You've built wealth and success, but that's not enough. You need social standing to match your economic power. His eyes narrowed. And you think a Chinese bride gives me that? I think the right woman could give you that, regardless of her heritage. But I also think you're right. I probably can't be that woman for you, not in the way you imagined. Maylin felt something crack inside her chest, but she kept her voice steady. So tell me what you want me to do. Should I return to Boston? Try to find work somewhere else? I have a little money, enough for maybe a month of room and board if I'm careful. I can… Stop. Daniel held up a hand. Just stop talking for a minute. She stopped. He pushed away from the desk and paced to the window again, his movement sharp with frustration. This isn't… He broke off, started again. I don't know what to do with this. With you. I spent months planning this, making arrangements, building expectations. And now you're here and everything's different, and I need to figure out what the hell happens next. You could marry me anyway. The words came out before she could stop them, bold and desperate in equal measure. Daniel spun to face her. What? Maylin's heart hammered, but she pushed forward. You could marry me anyway. We could make it work. I know it's not what you planned, but you think I'm going to marry someone out of pity or obligation? I think you're going to marry someone for practical reasons, which is what this always was. You don't know me. I don't know you. This was never about affection or compatibility. It was a business arrangement, and I can still fulfill my end of it. Except for the part where everyone who sees you will know exactly what you are. The words hung in the air between them, ugly and true. Maylin felt them land like blows, even though she'd been expecting them, even though she'd heard variations of them her entire life. Daniel's expression shifted, something like regret crossing his features. I didn't mean… Yes, you did. And you're right. People will see me and make assumptions. They'll talk. They'll judge. They'll question your decision. But they're going to do that anyway now, aren't they? You told people you were getting married. If I leave, you'll have to explain why your bride left. Either she rejected you, which makes you look weak, or you rejected her, which makes you look cruel. There's no version of this where you come out looking good. He stared at her, and she could see him working through the angles, calculating the costs. He was a businessman, she realized. Everything was risk and reward, investment and return. You're suggesting we go through with it, he said slowly. The marriage. Everything. I'm suggesting you give me a chance to prove I can do what you need. A trial period. A month, maybe 2. Let me manage your household. Let me show you what I'm capable of. If it doesn't work, if I can't handle it, or if the social complications are too much, then we dissolve the arrangement and I'll leave. But at least give it a chance before you decide it's impossible. And what do you get out of this? Besides avoiding a return to Boston? Maylin looked at him directly. letting him see the truth in her eyes. A home, a purpose, a life where I'm not constantly reminded that I'm unwanted. Maybe that's not much to you, but it's everything to me. The office door burst open before Daniel could respond. A man in dusty range clothes stood in the doorway, his face flushed, his breathing hard. "Boss, we got trouble. Miller fell off the barn roof, landed bad. His legs broke, bone came through the skin. Jack's trying to hold him steady, but he's screaming, and we don't—" The man's eyes landed on Mei Lin, and he stopped mid-sentence. "Sorry, ma'am. Didn't know you were—" "Where is he?" Daniel was already moving, his conversation with Mei Lin apparently forgotten in the face of immediate crisis. "East barn. We were replacing shingles and the ladder gave way." Daniel was out the door before the man finished speaking. Mei Lin stood, uncertain, as the two men's footsteps echoed down the hallway and out of the house. Through the window she could see people running toward the east barn. Men were shouting, and underneath it all she could hear screaming. High-pitched, agonized, the sound of someone in terrible pain. She should stay here. This wasn't her place, wasn't her crisis to manage. She was a guest, unwanted at that, with no authority and no right to insert herself into ranch business. But her feet carried her toward the door anyway. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding after the dim interior. Mei Lin lifted her skirts and walked quickly toward the barn, following the sound of chaos. Men crowded around the entrance, trying to see inside while staying out of the way. Mei Lin pushed through them with more force than they expected from a woman her size. No one stopped her, too surprised to react. Inside the barn, the scene was worse than she'd imagined. A man lay on the ground in a spreading pool of blood, his leg bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. White bone protruded through torn flesh and fabric. His face was gray, slick with sweat, and he was screaming with every breath, raw, animal sounds of pure agony. Daniel knelt beside him, along with another man who had to be Jack Crawford, the foreman Tom had mentioned. They were trying to hold the injured man still, but he kept thrashing, making everything worse. "Miller, you gotta stop moving," Jack was saying, his voice tight with stress. "You're making it worse. You gotta—" It hurts. Oh, Christ, it hurts. I know it does, but we need to set it before he goes into shock," Daniel said. "Someone ride to town for the doctor, but we can't wait. We have to set it now." "Boss, I don't know if I can—" Jack's face was pale. "I've never set a compound fracture. If we do it wrong, if we don't do it at all, he could lose the leg, or worse." Mei Lin found herself moving forward before she'd made a conscious decision. She knelt in the blood-soaked dirt beside Miller's head, her expensive traveling dress immediately ruined. Her hands, shaking only slightly, reached for his face. "What are you—" Daniel started. "I've read about this," Mei Lin said, her voice steadier than she felt. "In the medical guides. You need to immobilize him before you set the bone, or he'll hurt himself worse. And he needs something to bite down on." She pulled the handkerchief from her sleeve, one of her mother's, embroidered with peonies, and folded it quickly. "Miller, look at me. Look at my face, not your leg." Miller's wild eyes found hers, pain-glazed and desperate. "I need you to open your mouth," she said, keeping her voice calm and clear. "I'm going to give you something to bite down on. It will help. Can you do that for me?" He was beyond words, but he opened his mouth. Mei Lin placed the folded handkerchief between his teeth. "Good. Now I need you to focus on breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Can you do that? Breathe with me. In—" She demonstrated, making him watch her face. "And out." He tried to follow, his breathing ragged and irregular, but trying. Mei Lin looked at Daniel and Jack. "You need to pull the bone back into alignment and splint it. Use something rigid, boards from the wall, anything straight. And you need cloth for binding, clean cloth if possible." "You seem awfully calm for a lady who just arrived," Jack said, suspicion and something like respect warring in his voice. "I'm not calm. I'm terrified. But this needs to be done. And we're the ones who have to do it." She turned back to Miller, keeping her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to focus on her instead of the men about to hurt him worse. "Miller, they're going to set your leg now. It's going to hurt badly. Worse than it hurts now. But then it will start to feel better. I need you to stay as still as you possibly can. Look at me. Don't look at your leg. Don't look at them. Look at me." His eyes locked on hers, wide and terrified. Someone handed Daniel strips of clean cloth and two boards that looked like they'd been part of a crate. He positioned himself at Miller's leg, Jack across from him. They exchanged a look that contained entire conversations. "On three," Daniel said. "One," he didn't say two or three. He just pulled. Miller's scream tore through the barn, so loud and raw that Maylin felt it vibrate in her own chest. But she didn't let go of his face, didn't let him thrash. She held him still, her voice steady, even though her whole body wanted to shake. "Breathe, Miller. Just breathe. It's almost over. You're doing so well. Almost over." The bone disappeared back under the skin with a wet sound that made several of the watching men turn away. Daniel worked fast, positioning the boards, wrapping the cloth tight to immobilize the leg. His hands were steady, efficient, like he'd done this before. Miller had stopped screaming. He'd passed out, his body going limp in the dirt. Maylin sat back on her heels, her hands trembling now that it was over. Blood soaked the hem of her dress, splattered her sleeves. She could feel it sticky on her fingers. Daniel looked at her across Miller's unconscious form. His expression was unreadable, but something had shifted in his eyes. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked quietly. "I read medical guides on the train. I thought—" She had to swallow against the nausea rising in her throat. "I thought it might be useful. On a ranch. Far from doctors. Reading about it isn't the same as doing it." "No, it's not." Maylin stood, her legs unsteady. The barn spun slightly, and she had to lock her knees to keep from falling. "But someone had to do it, and I was here, so I did." Jack was staring at her like she'd grown a second head. "Ma'am, I've seen grown men lose their breakfast over less than what you just helped with. And I'm going to lose mine in about 30 seconds if I don't get outside," Maylin said honestly. She made it out of the barn and around the corner before her stomach rebelled. She vomited into the dirt, her whole body shaking, the smell of blood and sweat and fear overwhelming every sense. When there was nothing left, she leaned against the barn wall and closed her eyes, trying to remember how to breathe normally. Footsteps approached, and then Daniel's voice, closer than she expected. "Here." She opened her eyes to find him holding out a canteen. She took it with trembling hands and rinsed her mouth, spitting into the dirt. "Thank you," she managed. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there, watching her with that same unreadable expression. Behind them, she could hear men moving Miller, talking in low voices about getting him to the bunkhouse, making him comfortable until the doctor arrived. "That wasn't what I expected," Daniel said finally. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Screaming, maybe, fainting, running away. Not—" He gestured vaguely at the barn. "Not that." Maylin pushed away from the wall, standing on her own again, even though her legs still felt like water. "I've spent my entire life being underestimated. People see me and make assumptions about what I can or can't handle. They're usually wrong." "I'm starting to see that." She looked down at her ruined dress, at the blood drying dark on the blue fabric. "I should change. This is—" "Don't." Daniel's voice was sharp enough that she looked up in surprise. "Don't change yet. Come with me first." He turned and started walking, not toward the house, but toward the bunkhouse where they'd taken Miller. Maylin followed, confused, her dress rustling stiffly with dried blood. Inside the bunkhouse, Miller lay on a bed, still unconscious but breathing steadily. The men who'd helped move him stood around awkwardly, not sure what to do now that the crisis had passed. Daniel raised his voice to address all of them. "This is Miss Maylin Whitaker from Boston. She's my bride, and as of today, she's the mistress of this ranch. What you just saw in that barn, that's what she's made of. Anyone who has a problem with her, come talk to me directly. Anyone who disrespects her answers to me personally. Is that clear?" The men nodded, their eyes moving between Daniel and Maylin with new calculation, new assessment. Jack Crawford stepped forward, pulling off his hat. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for doubting you earlier, and thank you for helping with Miller. I don't know if we could have done it without you keeping him calm." "You would have managed," Maylin said, finding her voice again. "But I'm glad I could help. If you need anything at all, you just ask. Any of us." Jack looked around at the other men who nodded agreement. Daniel put his hand on Maylin's lower back. Light contact, but deliberate. A statement of ownership, of partnership. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." He guided her out of the bunkhouse and back toward the main house. Neither of them spoke until they were inside, the door closed behind them, the noise of the ranch muffled by thick walls. In the hallway, Daniel stopped and turned to face her. "I'm still angry about the deception, I still don't know if this can work the way I planned, but what you did out there—" He paused, choosing his words. "That took courage. Real courage, not the pretend kind people perform. You could have stayed in the office. No one would have blamed you, but you didn't." "I couldn't just hide while someone was hurt. Most people would have. Most people do." He studied her face like he was seeing her for the first time. "I need to think about this, about what happens next. But in the meantime, you're a guest in my home, and you should be treated like one. Tom will have taken your trunk to the blue guest room upstairs. There's a washroom next to it with hot water. Take your time. Rest if you need to. We'll talk more at dinner. Daniel." She stopped, unsure what to call him. How to address this man who was supposed to be her husband but wasn't, not yet, maybe not ever. "Yes?" "Thank you for not sending me away immediately." His expression softened slightly. "The day's not over yet. Don't thank me until you know how it ends." He left her there in the hallway, his boots echoing on the wooden floors as he headed back toward his office. Maylin stood alone for a moment, feeling the weight of the past hour settle over her like a physical thing. Then she climbed the stairs to the blue guest room, her blood-stiffened dress rustling with every step. The room was simple but clean, a bed with a thick quilt, a dresser, a washstand, and a door that led to a small washroom that actually had a bathtub. Her trunk sat at the foot of the bed, already delivered as promised. Maylin stripped off the ruined dress and left it in a pile on the floor. She'd burn it later, maybe. Or try to save it, though she couldn't imagine getting the blood out. Her hands were stained red-brown, her arms speckled with it. She filled the tub with water from the cistern, lukewarm but clean, and sank into it, watching the water turn pink around her. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking now that she was alone, now that there was no one to be strong for. She'd held a man's head while they set his broken bone. She'd looked at exposed bone and blood and agony, and she hadn't run. She'd done what needed doing because there was no one else to do it, and Daniel Hayes had seen it. More than that, he'd claimed her in front of his men, called her his bride, the mistress of the ranch. Maybe he'd regret it later. Maybe he'd take it back when he'd had time to think. But for now, in this moment, she had something she'd never had before. A chance. Maylin scrubbed the blood from her hands and arms, watching it swirl away in the bathwater. She thought about Miller's screaming, about the wet sound of bone moving, about the way Daniel's hands had been steady while hers shook. She thought about what it would mean to stay here, to build a life in this harsh, beautiful place, to be Daniel Hayes' wife, in name, at least, if not in fact, to face the judgment and whispers and assumptions that would come. She thought about the alternative, going back to Boston, admitting defeat, letting Margaret win. The water had gone cold by the time she climbed out and dried off. She dressed in one of her simpler dresses, gray wool, practical, nothing fancy. Braided her hair and pinned it up, looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser. She looked tired, pale, but also somehow different than she had this morning. Something in her eyes had changed, something had hardened or clarified or both. Dinner was in 3 hours. She had that long to prepare herself for whatever decision Daniel Hayes had reached, that long to steel herself for either acceptance or rejection. Maylin lay down on the bed and closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to the barn, to Miller's screaming, to the moment when she'd chosen to step forward instead of stepping back. She'd made that choice instinctively, without thinking through the consequences. But lying here now, she realized it had been more than just an instinct to help. It had been a declaration. She was not the useless, fragile thing Margaret had claimed her to be. She was not a burden or a joke or a mistake. She was someone who could stand in blood and chaos and do what needed doing. And if Daniel Hayes couldn't see that, couldn't value that, then maybe he wasn't the right person to build a life with anyway. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt almost like freedom. A knock on the door pulled Maylin from the space between sleep and waking. She sat up, disoriented, the afternoon light through the window suggesting she'd dozed off despite thinking she wouldn't. "Yes? Miss Whitaker?" A woman's voice, unfamiliar. "May I come in?" Maylin smoothed her dress and opened the door to find a woman perhaps 10 years older than herself, with sun-weathered skin and hands that had seen hard work. She carried a tray with a teapot and cup, steam rising in the cool air. "I'm Sarah Connor. I manage the household here. cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. Mr. Hayes thought you might like some tea after this afternoon's excitement. Her eyes were kind but assessing, taking in every detail of Mei Lin's appearance with the thoroughness of someone whose opinion would matter. Thank you. That's very thoughtful. Mei Lin stepped back to let her enter. Sarah set the tray on the small table by the window and poured with practiced efficiency. I heard what you did in the barn. Tom Riley's got a mouth on him, and news travels fast around here. The men are talking about it already. I'm sure they are. Mei Lin accepted the cup, wrapping her hands around the warmth. I imagine I'm not what anyone expected. That's the truth. Sarah's directness was startling after years of Boston's veiled comments and careful implications. But expectation and reality don't always match up, do they? Sometimes reality's better. And sometimes it's worse. Also true. Sarah moved to collect the ruined dress from where Mei Lin had left it on the floor. She examined the bloodstains with a critical eye. This might be salvageable. I've gotten worse out of work clothes. Want me to try? You don't have to. Didn't ask if I had to. Asked if you wanted me to. Mei Lin found herself smiling despite everything. Yes. Thank you. I'd appreciate that. Sarah nodded and draped the dress over her arm. Dinner's at 6. Mr. Hayes eats in the dining room when there's company. Otherwise, he takes his meals in the office while he works. Tonight will be the dining room. You should know he's particular about punctuality. Not mean about it, just particular. I'll be ready. Sarah paused at the door, her expression shifting to something more serious. Whatever happens between you and Mr. Hayes, whatever gets decided about this arrangement, I want you to know something. What you did today took guts, real guts. That matters around here. Character matters. More than anything else, really. She left before Mei Lin could respond, pulling the door closed with a soft click. Mei Lin sat by the window and sipped the tea. Strong and bitter, nothing like the delicate blend served in Boston parlors. She watched the ranch through the glass as the afternoon wore on. Men moved with purpose between buildings, their work never quite finished. Horses whinnied in the corrals. Somewhere, a hammer rang against metal in steady rhythm. This could be her life. This activity, this purpose, this community of people who measured worth by what you did rather than who your parents were. The possibility of it made something ache in her chest. Or it could all end tonight at dinner. Daniel could tell her he'd made his decision and she'd be gone by morning. The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing would have been. At 5:30, Mei Lin changed into one of the dresses from her trousseau, a deep green that Margaret had chosen because it was suitable for a rancher's wife without being too optimistic about the outcome. She took extra care with her hair, pinning it in a style that was elegant but practical. Applied no powder or rouge. She'd learned early that trying to look more acceptable only highlighted how unacceptable she was. She descended the stairs at precisely 6 o'clock. The dining room was smaller than she'd expected but well appointed. A solid oak table that could seat 8, though only 2 places were set tonight. A sideboard against one wall held serving dishes, and the walls were bare except for a single painting of the mountain range visible from the front porch. Daniel was already there, changed into clean clothes, but still wearing the weight of the day in his posture. He stood when she entered, a courtesy that surprised her after the informality she'd witnessed on the ranch. Miss Whitaker. Mr. Hayes. They sat, and Sarah appeared from the kitchen with plates of food that smelled better than anything Mei Lin had eaten in weeks. Roasted meat, potatoes with butter, vegetables she didn't recognize but that looked fresh and well prepared. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sound the scrape of silverware against china. Mei Lin forced herself to eat steadily despite having no appetite, aware that everything she did was being observed and evaluated. Finally, Daniel set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. The doctor arrived about an hour ago. He said we did everything right with Miller's leg, set it clean, immobilized it properly. He's sedated now, resting. Doc thinks he'll keep the leg if infection doesn't set in. That's good news. It is. Daniel picked up his water glass, then set it down again without drinking. I've been thinking about our conversation this afternoon, before Miller fell. Here it was. The decision. Mei Lin folded her hands in her lap to hide their trembling and waited. You were right about several things, Daniel continued. This was always a business arrangement. I wanted a wife who could help me build something bigger than just a successful ranch, someone who could open doors in society, help me establish connections with territorial officials and business partners. Someone educated enough to hold her own in those circles. And I can't give you that. Not the way you imagined. Maybe not exactly the way I imagined, but here's what I didn't imagine. I didn't imagine someone who would walk into a barn full of blood and panic and take control of a crisis without being asked. I didn't imagine someone who would kneel in the dirt and hold a screaming man's head while we set his bone. I didn't imagine someone brave enough to come all this way knowing they were being used as a joke. Mei Lin's throat tightened. I'm not sure that's bravery. It might just be lack of options. There's always options. You could have stayed in Boston, found work somehow, married someone there eventually. You chose this instead. That took courage, even if it also took desperation. He picked up his fork again, pushed food around his plate. I talked to Jack after you went upstairs. He said something interesting. He said the men respect action over breeding any day. Said if you could keep your head in a crisis like that, you could probably handle most of what ranch life throws at you. Jack Crawford doesn't have to navigate territorial society. Neither do your ranch hands. No, but they're the ones who make this place run. Their opinion matters, and they saw something today that impressed them. Daniel met her eyes across the table. I'm not going to pretend there won't be complications. There will be. People will talk, some will judge, some will use it against me in business dealings. I need to be realistic about that. I understand. But here's what I'm thinking. You were right that sending you back now makes me look either weak or cruel. And more than that, it would be a waste. You clearly have skills, intelligence, capability. Skills I need, actually. This house has been managed by Sarah for years, and she does fine with the basics, but she's not equipped to handle entertaining business guests or managing the kind of household I want to build. She knows it. I know it. You could do that. As your wife? As my wife in name. We'd marry, make it legal and binding. You'd run the household, represent me when needed, fulfill those duties. But the marriage itself would be, practical. A partnership, not a romance. Mei Lin absorbed this, trying to read between the careful words. Separate bedrooms. Separate bedrooms. Separate lives in many ways. We'd present a united front publicly, but privately, we'd each have our own space, our own independence. You'd have security, a home, a position. I'd have someone capable managing things I don't have time for. That's a generous offer given the circumstances. Daniel's laugh was short and without humor. Generous? I'm asking you to marry a man you don't know and live in a place you've never been, all while knowing that society will judge you for existing. That's not generous, that's just less terrible than the alternatives. Still, you could send me away. You have every right to, given how you were deceived. Yeah, I could. But despite everything, despite the anger and the shock and the complication, I keep coming back to what you said this afternoon. You are refined. You are educated. You are capable. Everything in that letter was true except the one detail they thought would matter most. And maybe it does matter. I'm not naive, but maybe it doesn't matter as much as what I saw in that barn. Mei Lin set down her own fork, her food barely touched. What exactly did you see? Someone who doesn't quit. Someone who steps forward instead of back when things get hard. Someone who can keep their head when everyone else is losing theirs. He paused. Someone I could build something with, even if it's not the something I originally planned. The words settled between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Mei Lin thought about accepting, about committing to this strange arrangement with this stranger in this wild place. Thought about what it would mean to be married but not truly married, to have security but not affection, to have a home but not necessarily belonging. It was more than she'd had in Boston, more than she'd expected when she left, more than she probably deserved given how she'd arrived. But was it enough? I need to ask you something, she said carefully. This arrangement, if I agree to it, if we go through with this marriage of convenience, what happens if things change? If you meet someone else, someone you actually want to marry for real, or if I do? Daniel considered the question seriously. Then we deal with it honestly. I won't trap you in something that becomes unbearable, but I also won't have you embarrass me or the ranch. If either of us wants out, we'd have to do it carefully, with discretion. Divorce is possible out here, not like in some places. It would be messy and complicated, but possible. Fair enough. You haven't answered the question, though. Will you stay? Will you marry me under these terms? Maylin looked at him across the table, this man who'd had his expectations shattered and was trying to rebuild them into something workable. He wasn't handsome in a classical sense, but he had good bones, strong features, eyes that suggested intelligence and determination. He was younger than she'd thought a successful rancher would be, which meant he'd built all this through sheer force of will. They weren't so different, really. Both of them trying to build something from nothing, both of them fighting against expectations and limitations, both of them willing to be practical when the situation demanded it. "I'll stay," she said. "I'll marry you, and I'll work harder than you can possibly imagine to make this arrangement worth your while." Something like relief crossed his face, though he hid it quickly. "Good. We'll do it soon. No point waiting around for people to ask questions. There's a minister in town who owes me a favor. I'll send for him tomorrow. We'll do a simple ceremony here at the ranch. Nothing fancy." "Nothing fancy," Maylin agreed. They finished the meal in a silence that was less awkward than before, though still weighted with everything unsaid. When Sarah came to clear the plates, she looked between them with an expression that suggested she'd already guessed the outcome. "I'll start preparing the master bedroom," Sarah said to Daniel. "Should have it ready by the weekend." "The master bedroom can wait," Daniel said. "Miss Whitaker will stay in the blue guest room for now. We'll transition things gradually." Sarah's eyebrows rose fractionally, but she just nodded. "As you say, sir." After dinner, Daniel returned to his office and Maylin retreated to the guest room, both of them seemingly relieved to have some distance after the intensity of the day. Maylin sat by the window and watched the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors she had no names for. She was getting married in a few days to a man she'd met this morning. A man who'd made it clear he was marrying her out of practicality rather than desire. A man who wanted a business partner, not a wife. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt strangely like victory. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah proved to be an invaluable ally, helping Maylin understand the rhythms of the ranch, the expectations, the unwritten rules that governed life here. The men were polite but distant, still evaluating this strange woman who would be their boss's wife. Only Jack Crawford made any real effort at friendliness, stopping by the house to check on Miller's progress and nodding respectfully to Maylin whenever their paths crossed. The minister arrived on the third day, a tired-looking man named Reverend Walsh, who asked no questions about the unusual circumstances and seemed mainly interested in getting back to town before dark. The ceremony was scheduled for that afternoon in the ranch house parlor. Maylin dressed in the white dress from her trousseau, simple, elegant, appropriate for a frontier wedding if not a Boston one. Sarah helped her with the buttons and fussed over her hair until it was perfect. "You look beautiful," Sarah said quietly. "I look acceptable." "Same thing sometimes." The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike. Daniel wore a suit that looked uncomfortable on him, like he'd rather be in range clothes. The witnesses were Jack Crawford and Sarah Connor, both of them standing solemnly as Reverend Walsh read through the traditional vows in a voice that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times before. When it came time for the promises, Maylin spoke her lines clearly and without hesitation. Daniel did the same, his voice steady. They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Daniel had apparently purchased in town, and then it was done. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Walsh said. Daniel leaned in and pressed a brief, dry kiss to Maylin's cheek. Perfectly appropriate. Completely devoid of passion. "Congratulations," the Reverend said, closing his book. "May your union be blessed with prosperity and—" "Thank you, Reverend," Daniel interrupted smoothly. "Jack will see you back to town and settle your fee. Sarah, I believe you prepared some refreshments?" Sarah had, and the four of them, 5 counting the Reverend who stayed long enough to eat 2 pieces of cake, stood around making awkward small talk about the weather and the cattle and anything except the strange marriage they'd just witnessed. When the Reverend finally left, Jack and Sarah made polite excuses and disappeared, leaving Daniel and Maylin alone in the parlor. "Well," Daniel said, "that's done." "Yes, it is. I have work to catch up on. I'll be in my office if you need anything." He started to leave, then paused. "You should know. I'll be traveling to Cheyenne next week for meetings with territorial officials. 3 days, maybe 4. You'll be in charge of the household while I'm gone." "I understand. Jack will handle ranch operations. Any problems, you go to him. But the house, the staff, any visitors who might come by, that's your domain now." It was a test, Maylin realized. He was giving her responsibility and space to prove herself without his oversight. "I won't disappoint you," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I don't think you will." After he left, Maylin stood alone in the parlor, wearing her wedding dress with no one to see it. She should feel something, she thought, joy or sadness or fear or hope. Instead, she just felt tired and oddly calm. She was married now. Maylin Hayes, rancher's wife, mistress of this house and land. It was legal and binding and real. And no one in Boston even knew yet. Maylin climbed the stairs to her room and changed out of the wedding dress, folding it carefully and putting it away in the wardrobe. It had served its purpose. She might never wear it again. That night, she sat at the small desk in her room and pulled out writing paper. The letters to Boston had been weighing on her mind since the ceremony. She'd put them off, unsure what to say, but now there was no avoiding it. She started with Margaret because that one was easiest. Dear Mrs. Whitaker, I write to inform you that I arrived safely in Wyoming Territory and was married to Mr. Daniel Hayes on the 17th of this month. The ceremony was simple but proper, witnessed by his foreman and household manager. Mr. Hayes has proved to be a man of integrity and intelligence, and his ranch is prosperous and well managed. I am sure you will be pleased to know that your investment in my education has paid dividends. My training has proved invaluable in managing Mr. Hayes's household and representing his interests. The skills you so graciously provided have found their purpose here. I trust this news finds you well and relieves you of any concern regarding my situation. Respectfully, Maylin Hayes. The letter was perfect in its passive aggression. Margaret would read between every line and know exactly what Maylin was saying. I survived. I succeeded. You didn't break me. She sealed it and set it aside, then pulled out fresh paper for a second letter. This one was harder. Dear Miss Chen, I hope this letter finds you and your family in good health. I wanted to let you know that I have arrived safely in Wyoming Territory and have married Mr. Daniel Hayes, a rancher of good standing. The journey was long, but uneventful. The landscape here is unlike anything I could have imagined, vast and wild and beautiful in ways that photographs cannot capture. I think my mother would have liked it here. There is a freedom in the open spaces, a sense of possibility. I find myself remembering things she told me when I was young, lessons I didn't understand then, but make sense now. If you would, please light incense for her at the temple. Tell her I am finding my way. With gratitude and respect, Maylin Hayes. She sealed that letter too and set both aside for posting. Tomorrow, she would ask Tom how to send mail from the ranch. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of actually being Mrs. Daniel Hayes. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply sit in the quiet of her room and feel the weight of what had happened. She'd traveled across the country, survived her own family's cruelty, helped set a broken bone, and married a stranger in a ceremony that was more business transaction than sacred vow. And somehow, impossibly, she was still standing. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Come in. Sarah entered carrying a tray with tea and something wrapped in cloth. Thought you might like this. It's a tradition here. The women bake bread for new brides. Supposed to bring luck to the marriage. She set down the tray and unwrapped a small loaf, still warm, that smelled like honey and grain. Thank you. That's very kind. Sarah hesitated at the door. Can I ask you something, Mrs. Hayes? The name still sounded foreign, but Maylin nodded. Why did you really come here? And don't tell me you had no choice. Everyone has choices. You chose this one. Why? Maylin considered lying, softening the truth, but Sarah's directness deserved honesty in return. Because I wanted to matter. In Boston, I was something to be hidden or explained away or apologized for. Here, I thought I might be able to be something else. Even if it's just a rancher's practical wife who manages his household, that's more than I was there. Sarah smiled. Well, you matter now. To Mr. Hayes, whether he admits it or not. To Miller, who'd probably be dead without you. To me, because you just made my job a whole lot easier having someone to help run this place properly. She paused. And to yourself, I hope. That's the one that counts. After Sarah left, Maylin broke off a piece of the bread and tasted it. It was good, simple and honest and exactly what it claimed to be. Like this life she was building, like the woman she was becoming. She finished the bread and the tea, then climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Somewhere in this house, Daniel Hayes was probably working in his office, going through ledgers and planning tomorrow's work. Her husband in name, a stranger in reality, but they had time. They had an arrangement that gave them both what they needed, even if it wasn't what they'd wanted. And if today had taught her anything, it was that she was capable of handling far more than anyone had ever given her credit for. Tomorrow she would wake up as Mrs. Hayes and begin learning what that meant. She would make mistakes, probably, would struggle with things she didn't understand, would face judgment and difficulty and all the complications Daniel had warned about. But she wouldn't quit. She wouldn't run. She would prove to everyone, to Margaret, to Daniel, to the ranch hands who still looked at her with uncertainty, and most of all to herself, that she belonged here. Not because someone gave her permission, but because she'd earned it. The certainty of that settled over her like a blanket, warm and solid. Sleep came easier than it had in days, and for the first time since leaving Boston, Mei Lin didn't dream about the past. She dreamed about tomorrow. The first test came sooner than Mei Lin expected. 3 days after the wedding, Daniel left for Cheyenne as planned, riding out before dawn with instructions that were more permission than guidance. The household was hers to manage. The decisions were hers to make. She discovered quickly that running a ranch house was nothing like managing a Boston household. There were no formal calling hours, no elaborate menus planned weeks in advance, no servants who disappeared into invisibility between tasks. Sarah worked alongside her rather than beneath her, and the two women developed a rhythm born of necessity rather than hierarchy. The real challenge came on the second day of Daniel's absence, when Jack Crawford appeared at the kitchen door with bad news written all over his face. "Mrs. Hayes, we've got a situation. 3 men just rode up claiming they're from the Territorial Land Office. They're saying there's a dispute about our northern boundary, that we've been grazing cattle on land we don't own. They want to see Mr. Hayes immediately." Mei Lin set down the account book she'd been reviewing. "Mr. Hayes isn't here." "I know, ma'am, but they're not asking, they're demanding, and one of them is Carter Blackwood." The name meant nothing to Mei Lin, but Jack's expression suggested it should. "Who is Carter Blackwood?" "Trouble. He owns the ranch north of us, been trying to buy us out for years. Mr. Hayes won't sell, so Blackwood's been looking for other ways to cause problems. This boundary dispute, I'd bet money it's manufactured." Mei Lin stood, smoothing her skirts. "Where are they?" "Front porch. I told them to wait there." "Good. Give me 5 minutes, then bring them to the parlor. And Jack, stay close. I may need you." She went upstairs and changed quickly into one of her more formal dresses, the dark blue with jet buttons that Margaret had chosen because it made her look appropriately serious for frontier life. She pinned her hair severely, no softness, no concession to charm. Then she went to Daniel's office and retrieved the land survey documents she'd found while organizing his papers the day before. In the parlor, she arranged herself in the chair behind the small writing desk. The documents spread before her in careful order. When Jack showed the 3 men in, she didn't stand. Carter Blackwood was exactly what she'd expected. Late 40s, expensive clothes that didn't quite hide the hardness underneath, eyes that assessed her value in the time it took to cross the threshold. The 2 men with him wore badges from the Territorial Land Office, but their body language suggested they answered to Blackwood more than any government authority. "Mrs. Hayes," Blackwood said, his smile not reaching his eyes, "I apologize for the intrusion. We were hoping to speak with your husband about a rather urgent matter. Mr. Hayes is in Cheyenne on business. I managed the ranch in his absence. You may state your business to me." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. He'd expected intimidation to work on a woman, Mei Lin realized. Expected her to defer to male authority immediately. Well, that's unusual. But I suppose we can explain the situation and you can relay it to your husband when he returns. He gestured to one of the land office men, who pulled out a map. "There appears to be a discrepancy in the northern boundary of Hayes Ranch. Our survey shows that approximately 300 acres Mr. Hayes has been using actually belongs to the Blackwood Ranch. We've come to resolve this matter before it becomes a legal issue." Mei Lin studied the map they laid on the desk. Then she pulled out Daniel's survey documents and placed them beside it. "Interesting. The survey commissioned by Mr. Hayes last year shows something quite different. According to this, which was conducted by the territorial surveyor, not a private company, The boundary line runs along Copper Creek, which places those 300 acres firmly within Hayes Ranch property. One of the land office men shifted uncomfortably. Blackwood's jaw tightened. That survey was disputed, Blackwood said. By whom? By me. And I've had a second survey done that contradicts it. A second survey commissioned and paid for by you, conducted by surveyors you hired. Maylin met his eyes without blinking. Forgive me, Mr. Blackwood, but that seems rather convenient. Are you suggesting I'm lying? I'm suggesting that when there are conflicting surveys, the one commissioned by neutral parties carries more weight. And according to territorial law, she pulled out another document, one she'd found in Daniel's files and stayed up late reading. When boundary disputes arise, the original land grant takes precedence unless clear evidence of fraud can be demonstrated. Mr. Hayes's land grant, which I have here, explicitly includes all territory east of Copper Creek up to the base of the mountain range. Blackwood's pleasant facade was cracking. You seem awfully well informed for a woman who just arrived. I read, Mr. Blackwood. It's a useful skill. Reading and understanding are different things. Land law is complex. Perhaps you should wait for your husband to return before making statements you don't fully comprehend. Maylin stood, and though she was significantly shorter than all three men, something in her posture made them step back slightly. Let me be very clear. The land you're claiming belongs to Hayes Ranch. It has belonged to Hayes Ranch since the original grant 5 years ago. Your survey is disputed and, frankly, suspect given that you commissioned it yourself. If you wish to pursue this through legal channels, Mr. Hayes will meet you in court. But you will not intimidate your way onto this property, and you will not use his absence as an opportunity to press false claims. False claims? Blackwood's voice rose. You don't know what you're talking about. You're Chinese? Maylin supplied the word he'd been circling. Yes, I am. I'm also Mr. Hayes's legal wife, which means I have authority to act on his behalf. And I'm also someone who's dealt with men like you my entire life. Men who mistake courtesy for weakness and silence for stupidity. You made a mistake coming here while Mr. Hayes was gone, thinking you could bully your way through a woman. But I'm not the woman you expected. Jack had moved closer, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. The message was clear. Blackwood looked between Maylin and Jack, calculating odds and outcomes. Your husband will hear about this. When he returns, we'll settle this properly. I'm sure we will. Jack, please escort these gentlemen off the property. After they left, Maylin sat down hard in the chair, her hands shaking now that the confrontation was over. Sarah appeared in the doorway with tea that Maylin hadn't asked for but desperately needed. I was listening from the kitchen, Sarah said quietly. That was well done. I may have just made an enemy for Daniel. Blackwood was already an enemy. You just didn't back down from him, which is more than most people do. Sarah poured the tea with steady hands. Mr. Hayes needs to know about this when he returns. He will. Maylin sipped the tea, trying to calm the adrenaline still coursing through her. Do you think I overstepped? Should I have just told them to come back when Daniel was here? You did exactly what needed doing. You protected this ranch and showed Blackwood he can't push us around. That matters. Sarah paused. And you showed the men who work here that you're not just decorative. Word of this will spread through the bunkhouse by supper. It did. That evening, when Maylin walked to the barn to check on Miller's recovery, the men she passed nodded respectfully rather than with the awkward uncertainty that had marked her first days. Tom Ridley actually tipped his hat and called her ma'am, without the hesitation that usually preceded it. Miller was sitting up in bed, his leg in a splint, his color much better than when she'd last seen him. He brightened when she entered. Mrs. Hayes, I've been hoping you'd come by. I wanted to thank you proper for what you did. Doc said if you hadn't kept me calm, if the leg hadn't been set right away, I might have lost it. You would have done the same. Maybe. But most ladies wouldn't have. Most ladies would have fainted or run off. You didn't. He shifted carefully, mindful of his injury. I heard what you did today, too, standing up to Blackwood. The men are talking about it. I hope they're not talking too unkindly. Miller laughed. They're saying Mr. Hayes got himself a hell of a wife. Begging your pardon for the language, ma'am, but that's the exact phrase. Jack said you handled Blackwood like you'd been doing it your whole life. I have been, in a way. Different men, same tactics. Well, it's appreciated. This ranch, it's more than just work for most of us. It's home. Mr. Hayes built something good here, something fair. Men like Blackwood want to take that apart because they can't stand seeing someone succeed without playing dirty. You protecting it means something. Mei Lin left the barn feeling lighter than she had since arriving. She was beginning to understand something fundamental about this place. Respect wasn't given freely, but it was given genuinely once earned. No one cared about her family name or her education or her accomplishments in Boston society. They cared about what she did when it mattered. Daniel returned 2 days later, riding in just after sunset with the weariness of hard travel in every line of his body. Mei Lin met him at the door, and before he could even dismount fully, she told him about Blackwood's visit. His expression went from tired to furious in seconds. He came here? While I was gone? He thought I'd be an easy target. And? He was wrong. Daniel listened to her full account, his jaw working as she described the confrontation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I should have been here, he said finally. You were conducting business in Cheyenne. That matters too, and I was here, which was enough. You put yourself at risk. Blackwood isn't just an annoyance, he's dangerous. If he decided to push things further, Jack was there, and I wasn't going to let him intimidate me into giving up land that belongs to you. Daniel looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You said belongs to you, not belongs to us. Mei Lin hadn't realized she'd made that distinction. This is your ranch, your work. I'm just my wife, my partner in this arrangement, remember? He ran a hand through his hair, dust falling from it. If we're going to make this work, you can't keep thinking of yourself as separate from the ranch. What's mine is yours now, legally and practically. That land belongs to both of us. This house, these decisions, they're ours. The words caught Mei Lin off guard. In the weeks since their marriage, Daniel had been cordial but distant, maintaining the boundaries of their practical arrangement. This was the first time he'd suggested any real partnership. I'll remember that, she said quietly. Over the following months, that partnership deepened in unexpected ways. Daniel included her in business decisions, seeking her opinion on matters ranging from cattle purchases to contract negotiations. She discovered he valued her analytical mind, the way she could spot problems in agreements before they became costly mistakes. Her education, so dismissed in Boston, proved invaluable here. But the real change came gradually, almost imperceptibly. Conversations over breakfast that started as business discussions lingered into personal territory. Daniel telling her about how he'd built the ranch, the failures and near disasters along the way. Mei Lin sharing stories of her mother, the things she remembered, the things she'd lost. They weren't falling in love. It wasn't that simple or dramatic. But they were becoming partners in truth, not just in name. Learning each other's rhythms, respecting each other's strengths, covering each other's weaknesses. The first winter was hard. Mei Lin had never experienced cold like the Wyoming winter, snow that fell for days without stopping, temperatures that made breathing painful. But she learned to manage the household through it, to plan provisions, to keep the house warm and running even when storms cut them off from town for weeks at a time. She also learned to shoot. Daniel insisted after the Blackwood incident, and Jack taught her patiently until she could hit targets reliably at 20 paces. She'd never be a sharpshooter, but she'd be able to defend herself if needed. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Daniel had been invited to a territorial dinner in Cheyenne, a gathering of ranchers, businessmen, and territorial officials. The kind of event he'd originally wanted a wife for. You don't have to come, he said, though his tone suggested he hoped she would. I can make excuses. I'm coming, Mei Lin said firmly. This is exactly what you married me for, remember? To represent the ranch in society. That was before I understood what it would cost you. People will stare. Some will be rude. Others will be polite to my face and cruel behind my back. Let them. I've survived worse. The dinner was everything Mei Lin had expected and somehow still managed to be more difficult. The stares were constant, the whispers barely concealed. Several women made pointed comments about exotic choices and unusual arrangements. One territorial official's wife asked Mei Lin directly if she spoke English, despite having just heard her conversing in perfect, unaccented English moments before. But Mei Lin held her own. She discussed territorial politics with the men, cattle breeding with the ranchers, and matched the women's veiled insults with responses so polite and so sharp that they couldn't quite figure out if they'd been put in their place or complimented. On the ride home, Daniel was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For putting you through that. For thinking I could use your capabilities without considering the cost. The cost was worth it. Did you notice Governor Campbell spent 20 minutes talking to you about territorial legislation? He barely acknowledges most ranchers. And Mr. Thornton wants to meet about a cattle contract that could be very profitable. You made connections tonight that will matter for years." "You made those connections. You're the one who steered conversations, who made me look good, who handled the insults with grace I don't possess." Maylin looked at him in the dim lamplight of the carriage. "We made those connections. Together. That's what partnerships are." Something shifted in Daniel's expression. When did this become a real partnership instead of just a practical arrangement? "I don't know. Somewhere between the boundary dispute and tonight, I think." "Does it matter when?" "No, I suppose it doesn't." The second year brought unexpected prosperity. The contracts Maylin had helped secure paid off handsomely. The ranch expanded, hiring more men, buying more land. Daniel's influence in territorial politics grew, and he was appointed to several important committees. And with that prosperity came a different kind of challenge. Letters from Boston finally started arriving, not from Margaret, who maintained a cold silence, but from others. Thomas wrote once, a brief note acknowledging the marriage and expressing surprise at its apparent success. A few of Maylin's former acquaintances sent stilted congratulations, clearly unsure how to address someone they'd dismissed who had risen above their expectations. Maylin answered them all politely and briefly, giving them nothing to gossip about and no insight into her actual life. But then, nearly 2 years after her arrival, a letter came that was different. Miss Chen had written, her English careful and formal, to tell Maylin that Margaret Whitaker had fallen on hard times. Thomas's business ventures had failed, taking the family fortune with them. They were selling the Boston house, liquidating everything to pay debts. Margaret had apparently mentioned, in what Miss Chen described as a moment of weakness, that perhaps she had been too hasty in sending Maylin away, that perhaps connections to a successful Wyoming rancher might have been valuable. Maylin read the letter 3 times, waiting to feel satisfaction or vindication. Instead, she mostly felt tired and a little sad. Margaret had spent so much energy making Maylin feel worthless, and in the end, it had all been for nothing. She showed the letter to Daniel that evening. He read it carefully, then looked at her with a question in his eyes. "Are you going to help them?" "Should I?" "That depends. Do you want revenge or peace?" Maylin considered. "I thought I wanted them to suffer the way they made me suffer, but that feels empty now. They're already suffering. Adding to it doesn't change what they did to me. So what do you want?" "Peace. And to be done with them completely. To let that part of my life stay in the past where it belongs." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then write back and tell them you wish them well, but can't help financially. Offer nothing. Promise nothing. But don't be cruel. You're better than they are. Prove it by being gracious." She did exactly that, crafting a letter that was polite, distant, and final. She wished Margaret well, expressed hope that their circumstances would improve, but made clear that she had her own life now and would not be involving herself in Boston affairs. It felt like closing a door on a room she'd been trapped in for too long. Freeing, in a way she hadn't expected. The third year brought the biggest change of all. Maylin had been feeling unwell for weeks before she finally admitted to Sarah what she suspected. Sarah called for the doctor, who confirmed it with the kind of matter-of-fact attitude frontier physicians brought to everything. Maylin was pregnant. She told Daniel that evening in his office, unsure how he'd react. Their marriage had evolved beyond its practical origins, but they still maintained separate bedrooms, still navigated the space between business partnership and genuine marriage with careful uncertainty, except for one night 6 months earlier when the boundaries had blurred, a celebration after a particularly successful business deal, too much wine, proximity that became intimacy almost before either of them realized what was happening. They hadn't spoken of it afterward, both retreating to familiar distance. Now there was no retreating from the consequence. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, walked around the desk, and took her hands in his. "Are you all right?" Is everything... I'm fine. The doctor says everything looks normal. Good. That's good. He was still holding her hands, and she realized his were shaking slightly. I know this wasn't part of the arrangement. I know we didn't plan for this. No, we didn't. But if I'm honest, Mei-Lin, I stopped thinking of this as just an arrangement a long time ago. I don't know exactly when it happened, but somewhere along the way, you became more than just a practical solution. You became... He paused, searching for words. You became someone I couldn't imagine this life without. Mei-Lin felt something tight in her chest loosen. I felt it too. I kept telling myself it was just partnership, just respect, but it was more than that. Is more than that, Daniel corrected, present tense. Yes, is. He pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. We should probably stop sleeping in separate bedrooms. She laughed despite everything. That might be practical at this point. Practical, right. We're very good at being practical. The most practical couple in Wyoming territory. They were both laughing now, the tension breaking into something lighter, easier, something that felt suspiciously like happiness. The pregnancy was difficult. Morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that made managing the household a struggle, and fear that she tried to hide, but Sarah saw anyway. Sarah had been through this 4 times herself, and guided Mei-Lin through it with the same straightforward competence she brought to everything. Daniel hovered, anxious and trying not to show it. He hired additional help for the household so Mei-Lin wouldn't have to work as hard. He made Jack promise to handle everything on the ranch so he could stay close. He read medical books until Mei-Lin told him to stop because he was making himself anxious with worst-case scenarios. But he was there. Every day, every crisis, every moment of fear. There when she couldn't keep food down. There when her back ached too much to sleep. There when the uncertainty became overwhelming. And when Sarah started teaching Mei-Lin what she'd need to know for the birth, Daniel insisted on learning too. Sarah looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Men didn't attend births, didn't involve themselves in such matters. But Daniel was stubborn, and eventually Sarah relented. The baby came on a cold February morning after 16 hours of labor that left Mei-Lin certain she was going to die. But Sarah was there. And Daniel was there, and somehow she survived it. She survived it and held her daughter, red-faced and screaming and perfect, and felt something in her heart that she'd never experienced before. Pure, uncomplicated love. Daniel cried when he held her, this hard rancher who never showed weakness. He cried and held his daughter and said she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. They named her Rose, after no one in particular, just because Mei-Lin had seen wild roses blooming in the mountains and thought they were the most resilient flowers she'd ever encountered. The years that followed were full in ways Mei-Lin had never imagined possible. Rose grew into a fierce, bright child who loved horses and hated sitting still. Daniel expanded the ranch into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Mei-Lin became known not just as Daniel's wife, but as a force in her own right, managing household, business, and eventually helping establish a school for ranch families who lived too far from town for their children to get proper education. The school started small, just the children of Hayes Ranch employees meeting in a room Mei-Lin set aside in the main house. But word spread, and other ranches asked if their children could attend. Within 3 years, they'd built a proper schoolhouse and hired 2 teachers. Mei-Lin managed it all: curriculum, hiring, finding books. Securing funding from territorial education grants she spent months researching. But it was more than just academic education. Mei-Lin made sure the school taught practical skills alongside reading and arithmetic. The girls learned bookkeeping and contracts as well as domestic skills. The boys learned negotiation and writing as well as ranching. She wanted every child to have the tools to build whatever life they chose. And quietly, without making announcements or drawing attention, she made sure that any child was welcome, regardless of their background. When a Chinese railroad worker's daughter showed up, uncertain and afraid of rejection, Mei-Lin enrolled her immediately and made sure the other children understood that respect wasn't negotiable. Daniel supported it all, even when other ranchers questioned the expense or the purpose. He saw what Mei-Lin was building, not just a school, but a community where capability mattered more than heritage, where children could become more than their parents' circumstances. 5 years after Mei-Lin's arrival, the ranch held a celebration for the school's expansion into a permanent building. People came from across the territory: ranchers, business owners, territorial officials. Even the governor attended, praising the innovative approach to frontier education. Maylin stood on the porch of the schoolhouse with Daniel beside her and Rose running around with the other children and felt something she'd never quite felt before. Belonging, not just in the physical sense of having a home, but belonging to something bigger than herself. Being part of a community, contributing something that mattered, building something that would outlast her. That evening, after the guests had gone and Rose was asleep, Maylin and Daniel sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you ever think about Boston?" Daniel asked. "Sometimes, but not the way I used to. I used to think about it with pain, with anger about what they did to me. Now when I think about it, I mostly feel grateful." "Grateful?" "They tried to humiliate you by sending me here as a joke, but that joke became the best thing that ever happened to me. I found purpose here. I found respect. I found you and Rose and a life I never could have imagined." She looked at him in the dim light. "They thought they were punishing me, but they actually freed me." Daniel took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "I'm grateful too, for their cruelty, as strange as that sounds, because it brought you here, and you changed everything." "We changed everything," Maylin corrected. Together, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars multiply overhead in the vast Wyoming sky. Maylin thought about the girl who'd stood in that Boston parlor hearing her worth measured in mockery. Thought about the journey west, the terror and determination mixed together. Thought about every moment of doubt, every crisis, every time she'd had to prove herself. And she thought about what she'd built from all of that. Not just the school or the successful household or the partnerships and connections, but herself, the woman she'd become when freed from other people's expectations. Strong, capable, unbreakable. Not because she was perfect or because everything had been easy, but because she'd learned that strength came from getting back up, from choosing forward instead of backward, from building instead of breaking. Years later, when Rose was 12 and asking questions about how her parents met, Maylin told her the truth. Not a sanitized version, not a comfortable fairy tale. The real story, with all its ugliness and pain and eventual triumph. Rose listened with the seriousness she brought to everything, then asked, "Were you scared?" "Terrified." "But you came anyway." "I came anyway, because sometimes the scariest choice is also the right one." "Did you ever want to go back, to show them they were wrong about you?" Maylin considered the question carefully. "At first, yes. I wanted them to see what I'd become, to regret what they'd done. But eventually I realized that living well was better than any revenge. Building something good, being happy, proving to myself that I was worth more than they'd claimed, that mattered more than their opinion ever could." Rose nodded slowly, processing this. "I'm glad they sent you away. Otherwise you wouldn't have come here, and I wouldn't exist." "I'm glad too, sweetheart. Even though it was meant to hurt me, it gave me everything that matters." The school continued to grow, eventually expanding to include not just children, but adults who'd never had the chance to learn reading or arithmetic. Maylin taught some of those classes herself, working with ranch hands and settlers who came after long days of work because they wanted more than they'd been given. She saw herself in some of them, people told they weren't smart enough, capable enough, worthy enough, people who'd been underestimated and dismissed. And she showed them what she'd learned, that other people's judgments were just opinions, not truth, that capability could be learned, that it was never too late to become more than you'd been. And slowly, over years of work and determination, the ranch and its school became known for something unusual in the territory. A place where anyone could prove themselves regardless of background, where the Chinese cook's daughter could learn alongside the governor's son, where former soldiers and reformed outlaws and widowed mothers could all find education and respect. It wasn't perfect. There were still prejudices, still people who questioned or criticized or condemned, but Maylin had learned that you didn't need everyone's approval. You just needed enough good people willing to stand beside you. Daniel's influence in territorial politics eventually led to an appointment as territorial representative, a position that required travel to Washington occasionally. Maylin went with him sometimes, Rose other times, and saw a world far bigger than Boston or Wyoming. But she always came home, because this was where she belonged. On their 10th anniversary, Daniel gave her a gift that surprised her. A portrait he'd commissioned, not of her alone, but of her standing in front of the school, surrounded by children of different backgrounds, all of them looking at her with trust and respect. "This is how I see you," he said, "not as the woman they tried to throw away, but as the woman you became. Strong, capable, building something that matters." Maylin hung the portrait in the school's main room where every student could see it, a reminder that where you came from mattered less than what you built with the chance you were given. 15 years after leaving Boston, Maylin received one final letter from that life. Not from Margaret, who had died 2 years earlier without ever acknowledging her mistake, but from Thomas, now living in modest circumstances and working as a clerk. He wrote to apologize. Not for anything specific, not with excuses or justifications, just a simple acknowledgement that he'd been cruel and wrong. He'd heard about the school, about the ranch's success, about Maylin's reputation in the territory. He wanted her to know that he saw now what he'd been too blind to see then. Maylin read the letter to Daniel that evening, and they discussed whether to respond. "Do you want to?" Daniel asked. "I think I do. Not for him, really, but for me. To close that door completely." She wrote back a brief letter acknowledging his apology and wishing him well. No anger, no bitterness, just a clean ending to a chapter that had been over for years. When she sealed the letter, she felt something settle in her chest. Peace, finally. Complete and uncomplicated. She'd been sent west as a joke, a disposable burden, someone meant to embarrass a stranger and then disappear into obscurity. Instead, she'd built a legacy that would outlive everyone who'd ever doubted her. She'd turned humiliation into power, not through revenge or by proving anything to them, but by simply refusing to accept their definition of her worth. That night, standing on the porch of the house she'd helped build, looking out over land she'd helped expand, thinking about the school that bore her influence in every corner, Maylin understood something fundamental. They hadn't broken her by sending her away. They'd freed her to become who she was always meant to be. And that woman was extraordinary, not because she was perfect, but because she was resilient. Not because everything had been easy, but because she'd faced every difficulty and refused to quit. She'd been the wrong bride for the life they'd imagined, but she'd been exactly the right woman for the life she'd built. And that made all the difference.